Known commonly as the most subtle champion to be able to carry games, Sona tips the scales as a common pick for anyone who wants to embrace and master the enchanter playstyle. She graciously rewards careful play with incredible late game impact, and is one that I highly recommend to add as part of your champion pool. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Sona's purpose as a champion, and what success looks like in games that you are doing well on her. We'll then discuss different components of her kit, and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes different matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, pathing, and how to play out each phase of the game. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, would really appreciate a like on it if it helped you out. Moving on. Let's start with the runes. Sona follows the footsteps of many enchanters in terms of her rune setups, but it's important to know some slight alterations she needs to make in her rune setups to maximize her effectiveness. Her default page revolves around an airy keystone to naturally support this playstyle. Common runes that go along with this are things like Mana Flow Band, Absolute Focus or Transcendence depending on the matchup, and Gathering Storm. The best secondary tree in this case is typically Resolve as well, going Conditioning and Revitalize to give her a much needed boost in survivability while also giving her a chance to increase her impact on her teammates. This setup complements Sona's incredible scaling curve well. Into lane matchups and team compositions with heavy engage, Sona can and should also be going for a rune setup that inverses these trees, with Guardian as her keystone and then still getting her favorite runes from the sorcery side of things with her secondary tree. This allows her to access more defensive capability and attempt to survive the incredible engage from these team comps while still being able to maximize her stat boosting capabilities. With this page, you can typically go Guardian, Shield Bash, Conditioning, and Revitalize in your primary tree with a Mana Flow Band and Gathering Storm combination for your secondary tree. For Sona's adaptive runes, she typically can take a combination of double adaptive and the defensive rune of your choice depending on the matchup. In really slow lanes or in lanes where you want to scale up to your passive more, you can also opt for an ability haste rune in place of the first adaptive force rune, because it grants a significant portion of CDR that results in the ability for you to hit your mid game spike incredibly quickly. Taking scaling HP can also be a great option in matchups where nothing is generally happening regardless, for example enchanters into enchanters. Keep in mind though that support champions tend to be very underleveled relative to other champions in the game, so you should really only take it in situations where you absolutely know the game is going to go long. Jumping into items, Sona has a few unique parts to her build that help shape her playstyle, and it's actually rather important that you be cognizant of a few of these. We can first talk about mythic items, as that's probably the most straightforward component out of all of this. 9 times out of 10, Moonstone is going to be your mythic of choice. It's extremely easy for Sona to get the passive ticking on this item, and without even casting many of her abilities, she suddenly is putting out an incredible amount of healing and shielding overall. Positioning herself in fights is the harder component to this, but once that's mastered and locked down, it's incredibly easy for her to succeed. Against some team compositions where it's extremely important for her to instead focus on surviving as much as possible, then it's possible for Sona to go lock it instead. It's much more intuitive to play with Moonstone and you should realistically be using it as much as possible, but in cases where you really need the tankiness against assassins or heavy backline dive, it can be quite the asset to have. This mindset sort of continues into her matchups and starting items. Like other enchanters, while the default starting item is to heal spell thieves, in matchups into engage or pick champions that can punish you, you should heavily consider potentially opting into relic shield as well. This allows you to space these matchups accordingly and stabilize your early game significantly. After your first base, something that is fairly unique to Sona as a support champion is that she really needs to build tier. It's a fairly important item for her because she tends to otherwise have mana problems, and Sona's kit allows her to stack it much more rapidly than the other champions. Tier normally grants 3 mana per cast if you hit a target, and 6 if you hit a champion, but if you enchant one of your teammates with any of your abilities, this counts for the full 6 mana boost. Because of this, Sona can maximize the value she gets from tier, and can effectively have near infinite sustain in lane thanks to this. One other thing that I've seen in certain playstyles with Sona is to actually skip boots. It sounds very unintuitive at first considering how key boots are from almost every champion in the game, but Sona is pretty gold reliant, and she really feels the benefits when she actually skips building some tier 2s. If you do feel like you need the mobility however, I would recommend only completing them after you finish at least Moonstone so you have your most important item available. After this, you have a couple more options depending on what your team needs. More often than not, you will likely need to be your team's source of heal cut as well, so in games where you'll be needing it, you can opt for Chemtech Putrefier to give your team those much needed buffs. If that's not the case, feel free to finish off your tier and complete it into Archangel's Staff, which gives Sona a very nice power spike at 2 items here. At this point, you are generally leveled enough to be able to go into Wardstone, which is pretty much best in slot item for most support champions at this point into the game, assuming that you're about to hit level 13. Your last item is not really relevant at this point, but you can opt for many other support items that suit the job here, such as Staff of Flowing Water, Redemption, or even crazy stuff like Rabadon, since it's so late into the game and you really want to maximize your gold value. Sometimes you'll have other options that you'll need to upfront based on the needs of the comp as well. Some games, Mikhail's will be an incredibly clutch option for your priority targets. Maybe you'll need to pivot your mythic to lock it against heavy engage and so on. I also personally like to sit on Darkseal a lot of the time because the item itself is just so gold efficient. As long as you're thinking about the needs of the comp and how you should adapt your build to the needs of the game, you can't really go wrong. I'm quickly going to touch on good practice of things like abilities and combos for Sona, because the reality is that she pretty much has none to think of. So this section is more focused on ability optimization and making sure to take advantage of what she does have. In this case, everything that you basically would want to know will revolve around her passive, stacking it, and manipulating the auto attack that you would get out of it. Starting with the empowered auto itself, the nature of the bonus of the auto attack depends on the last used ability before it's primed. Especially in the case of her W and E, Sona can benefit greatly from the status impairments it can inflict onto her enemies. In most cases, if Sona is playing front to back and she uses her empowered W auto, she can effectively have exhaust on that opponent, which translates into a very significant amount of damage reduction. Her Power Chord E also allows Sona to access one of her only forms of CC in her kit outside of her ultimate, so you can use it to start ganks or follow up on a winning play. For whichever one of these abilities you want to use, try to use the other abilities in order to build up 2 out of your 3 stacks of Power Chord. If used in trades and skirmishes as well, keep in mind that Power Chord is an auto attack reset, so you should be playing around that. This can even be used for clearing wards. Touching on matchups, Sona's actually got a very interesting matchup curve as arguably the hardest scaling enchanter, and this gives her a clear win condition for most of her games. As long as she's able to stabilize in the early game, minimize deaths, and not have a severe disadvantage overall, she'll come out on top with her insane area of effect enchantment and great scalings. With this mindset, she has multiple paths to victory depending on the lane champion, and should adjust her game plan according to this. Against engaged champions and things of that nature, the only thing Sona really needs to do is live, realistically. You don't have to trade aggressively or do anything too far out, because that's not what her champion is intended to do here, and she puts herself at too much of a risk by doing this. As long as she can stabilize and keep the lane relatively even, then she personally will be in a good spot, all things considered. The only other concern in these types of matchups is that the enemy support might catch on to your playstyle and attempt to impact the map more in exchange. If this ends up being the case, the best you can do is communicate this to your teammates as much as possible and put pressure on your side of the map when you know you can, just so you can get as much leverage for your teammates as you can. This is also the mindset into the pick roam type champions like Pard or Pyke. Into other enchanter matchups, Sona is pretty much cruising. She never has to worry about getting too much pressure and can also play these matchups pretty slowly. The main distinction in her trades in these cases will be depending on whether the enchanter she's facing will have a lot of sustain or not. In cases where the enemy laner has a fair bit of sustain, Sona wants to slow down the pace of the lane in general so that the enemy sustain isn't as relevant. Sona is happy in these cases anyway because she can play very slowly and not have to worry about the enemy champion not scaling them. The mindset for this is that if the enemy is too healthy to really use their sustain tools, then their sustain tools are not going to be that relevant, right? The trick to succeeding in teamfighting in Sona revolves around giving yourself the respect that you deserve as a very important backline champion. This champion commits its entire early game so you can thrive in this stage of the game, but reaping the rewards of this commitment requires very gentle positioning. Stage yourself as absolutely far back as possible, your abilities are high range, high impact, and relatively non-committal. Embrace the mindset of other backliners in this case. You really want to chill, respect whatever engage or pick tools that the enemy has, and maximize your uptime of abilities. At this stage, the longer fights last, the happier you are. You'll simply stack check enemy teams thanks to the massive AoE buffs that you'll provide your teammates, as well as the fact that you'll have Moonstone fully stacked in most of these scenarios. When it comes to your ultimate, embrace the fact that you are using it more as a backwards defensive tool rather than an engage tool. Sona loves playing the front to back instead and can easily put the onus on the enemy team to engage onto her rather than the other way around. Although it is a large ability, it's relatively easy for the enemy to see it coming if you choose to make that obvious. Instead, use it primarily to buy space back for both you and your priority targets. To summarize, Sona is one of the best gateway champions into the enchanter support lifestyle. It provides an incredible reward to players that are patient in both the positioning and their game plan. Although easy to pick up, she actually has a lot of intricacies that reward investing time into her, and it's a great champion to master in the chaos of solo queue. As always, hope this guide helped you all out, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay fresh.